Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. Just last week, the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa were all in Fortaleza for BRICS 2014. Top of mind was the BRICS Development Bank, and everyone had an opinion. Speaking to South Africa's Finance Minister, Nhlanhla Nene, I began by asking him when we are likely to see the bank's first loan being made.
We now have the founding principles. We've said that all countries will now have to fulfill their legislative arrangements because, as you would know, each country has got its own. But as soon as that has been done, when the board meets and appoints the various chairpersons, but it's something that should happen quite soon. I can't put time to it, but we're all committed to moving. If we had our way, we would actually start today.
A lot of the narrative that we've heard over the last 48 hours around the bank has almost positioned it as an alternative to the Bretton Woods institution. We've just heard ministers as well making or confirming that statement. Why are we not hearing a convergence in terms of pulling together the efforts of the IMF and the World Bank together with the new development bank? Why does it seem that we are on opposite ends of the spectrum?
I don't think we are on the opposite end. In fact, what I said here was that we're going to continue with the reforms in the Bretton Woods institutions. All the countries are members of the IMF and the World Bank, and we see this actually as complementing, because we say there aren't adequate resources in those institutions to be able to address our developmental needs. Now we have something that would be focusing on the unique needs of the emerging economies. But it complements what is currently there. It's not only the Bretton Woods institutions. You can talk African Development Bank, and you saw also we also signed a cooperation agreement between the development finance institutions, where the DBSA also signed. So our backlog is so huge that we need more of these instruments in order to be able to achieve that.
Why does it matter so much where this bank is domiciled?
Well, I think it's good in a way that all the countries involved want to own it, because it suggests that it does have value. If everyone was like, oh, let it be, who cares, it would tell me something was wrong. So it is like with anything good, a desire to have one stamp on it. The control is, in terms of governance structure, will have to be all five equally. All five are equal contributors. But for whichever country gets the bank, I suppose there's everything that flows from it. The ability to employ and maybe shape the future of the institution.
If the scope of the bank is to be broader than just the BRICS member countries, as you've indicated, what value is this new development bank really going to give? We already have the African Development Bank. We have the likes of your China Development Bank already very active on the continent. What are we seeking to bring that other development institutions are not already doing in Africa?
To complement, really, not to compete, but to complement the work that is already being done by other DFIs, development finance institutions. As you said, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, IMF, but more importantly, this will be a bank with a difference, because for the first time, it is developing countries that are coming together and putting capital together to form a development bank on their own terms, and that will be sort of a nuance that will be there. But otherwise, I think the work will complement the work of the existing financial institutions, development financial institutions.
What would differentiate the new development bank, say, for example, from the Chinese Development Bank? Because China has already got such a huge footprint in terms of its operations on the African continent. What is this bank going to do that other development banks are not already doing?
Well, as you say, Chinese Development Bank is about Chinese expansion ambitions in the economic sphere, I would guess. The BRICS Development Bank should be about BRICS countries expanding their footprint among themselves and especially in the rest of the developing world. first and foremost. And number two, the BRICS Development Bank will have to obviously outline its own modus operandi. There may be elements of conditionalities which we'll hope will be far better than those of the World Bank, just to mention one institution. But at the same time, it should be better than that of the Chinese Development Bank, whose modus operandi I can't talk for. But we'd like to hope that the issue of human capital development, the issue of worker rights will feature very strong in terms of how the BRICS Development Bank promotes its lending practices.
Joining me now in studio to talk about BRICS 2014 and what it means for Africa is Stavros Nicolaou. He's a senior executive at Aspen Pharmacare, and he's also a BRICS Business Council member. And from our Cape Town studios, we're joined by Glenn Ho. He's a director at KPMG Advisory Services. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Stavros, let me start off with you.
Thank you.
Did we have a good summit? Was it worth South Africa's while?
Well, I think firstly the measure for me is what were the outcomes that we sought. And in my mind, there were three outcomes that would guide us as to whether it was successful or not. I think the first is, has the BRICS formation strengthened itself? I mean, from last year where we were to this year, have we gained greater political, greater economic ascendancy? And I think unquestionably the answer to that is yes, because just given the media exposure, let alone all the other exposure that the summit had, exposure around the development bank, there's been unprecedented interest in it. So that's telling me, it's giving me a message that BRICS is going from strength to strength as a political formation. I think secondly, there was a need to make an announcement on the bank, not only on its domicile, but to give some of the mechanics around the bank and what it would be doing. And I think that was adequately covered and spelt out. And I think some people have gone as far as saying that it will change the global economic order and realign it. So I think certainly that was delivered. And then thirdly, and probably selfishly speaking as a business council member, we had to lay a solid platform for the business council. And South Africa was, the South African chapter is chaired by Patrice Motsepe, and Patrice chaired the overall council whilst South Africa held the presidency of BRICS. And I think we delivered a very comprehensive report that sets out where the opportunities lie and sets out a sound platform from which Brazil now have to go and commence with the deal making. So in short, for me, the outcomes were all met. The institution or the formation is being strengthened, and I think we're starting as a BRICS formation, we're starting to position ourselves in the global pecking order according to where we should be.
Glenn, coming to you in Cape Town, in particular, let's zoom into the new development bank, and in particular South Africa getting the regional center for Africa's development, as it's now been called. Did we get a good deal on that front, especially in light of the fact that right up until the 11th hour, we still had hopes that Johannesburg would get the headquarters?
I think so, because if you look at some of the other members, they might have gotten the presidency or the in charge of the directors, but I think overall the regional centre will be here in South Africa. So I think that's something more permanent. So I think we got a good deal.
And of course, Stavros, it is permanent in the sense that there's no rotation. Given that that opportunity for continuity, what should the focus areas be of the regional centre? How should they prioritize how they begin to break up the pie, not only for South Africa, but for the broader continent that's looking on to see if these funds are going to flow to them?
You know, what's very important for me is that we all continuously lament the unemployment levels, the diminished growth levels on the African continent. And I think a large part of the solution to that is our ability to roll out infrastructure so that you can start manufacturing hubs and manufacturing bases. And what we found is traditionally there hasn't been access to capital to fund those infrastructure projects. So that's why when people said, but this is a competitor to the Bretton Woods institutions and the IMF and all the rest of it, I don't see it that way. I see it that there's a lot of projects that need to be financed, And I think the more options you've got, the more competitive you're going to be, and the more you'll be able to roll out these infrastructure programs, and you'll be able to make the continent more competitive. The fact that the bank region is going to be based in Johannesburg allows us to start realizing, start implementing those infrastructure projects that will ultimately derive the type of growth that our continent needs. There's also been a big push, certainly at the BRICS Business Council level. There's been a huge push to integrate the rest of the African continent. So we don't necessarily see ourselves as the S in BRICS as being confined just to South Africa. There's a much bigger play here. And I think basing the bank regionally here in Johannesburg allows us to realize that vision of dragging in.
I want us to come back to the agenda for the BRICS Business Council, especially without the chairmanship of Patrice Motsepe. But before we do that, Glenn, let me come back to you. I mean, I think Stavros has touched on it. He spoke about the need for capital to fund infrastructure projects on the continent. We also heard Sandile Zungu talking about conditionalities that would be somewhat different from what the Bretton Woods institutions have previously offered. How do you make sense of that statement? What kind of conditionalities should we be focusing, or should the bank be focusing on, and saying these are the conditionalities that we either need to get rid of, or these are the conditionalities that we need to bring in? What do you make of that statement?
I think it's the development of the SMMEs around it. I think we heard some of that discussion at BRICS, that with this big foreign direct investment, that we need to use local suppliers and build local business and small business. And I think that's going to be crucial to the development of the African economy.
And just staying with you, Glenn, quickly, just before we go back to the break, again, as you saw, a number of questions posed. They're trying to find the differentiating factor of this new development bank against existing development institutions, and the African Development Bank came out quite often. What do you think the new development bank, or how should it be differentiating itself? What do you think the shine factor should be?
I think it's from the developing world, so it should understand the developing agenda and priorities. And I think it'll probably have to take the same attitude towards risk, but I think it'll take a longer view of risk management. So I think that'll probably be a key differentiator, a longer-term view of risk.
A longer-term view of risk. We're going to take a quick break on that note, but when we come back, more of the new developments from BRICS 2014. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa. Now, tonight we're talking about BRICS 2014 and what's in it for Africa. We do value your input on the topic, so please talk to us on email. That's investafrica@abn360.com, or talk to us on Twitter, following me at Nozipho Mbanjwa or at CNBC Africa. And remember that our show's hashtag is #InvestAfrica. Now, one of the interesting developments that came out of the summit was a discussion about the inclusion of the union voice in the BRICS talks. Just outside the Oasis Imperial, I asked South African unionist Zwelinzima Vavi what role the unions hope to play in the summit.
Well, we're still on the outside of the summit. We're not officially participating inside. We're meeting here from the unions of the participating countries. To one big statement we want to make is that we have to be inside. There can be no development anywhere in the world that doesn't take into consideration worker issues, because worker issues are developmental issues. So we're meeting here to plot about how we can strengthen the voice of workers, not outside but inside the BRICS summit. Just like business has managed to maneuver its way into the ears of the leadership of the BRICS, we want to do the same for the labor.
Who's attending this meeting that you're about to have?
Well, me, the leadership of COSATU and Fedosa NACTU, and as well as the leaders from here, Brazil, in Russia, in India, all the BRICS countries participating unions are here.
Okay, let's talk about the agenda that you're going to be pushing, understanding that it's about making sure that the voice of the unions is heard within the BRICS summit. But are there any key issues that are top of the agenda for you today?
The issue of development, industrialization of the BRICS countries, and the links between not only the BRICS but the whole of the South and the progressive North is absolutely critical for the development of not only the African continent but the entire Latin America, Asian economies. Those linkages are very important, and today nobody can survive on its own. We need to create these economic blocks and to survive.
Well, still with me is Stavros Nicolaou, a senior executive at Aspen Pharmacare, as well as a BRICS Business Council member, and from our Cape Town studios, Glenn Ho, director at KPMG Advisory Services. Glenn, let's start off with you. We've heard some of the comments that Vavi has made, but what stands out for me is that back here in South Africa, the labor strife is perhaps top of mind, and yet we don't seem to get the same sense from the rest of the other BRICS member countries. Does this in any way undermine our competitiveness within the group?
I don't think so. I think it's actually a good thing. It's to get labour on board, and often we overemphasize our labour issues. I mean, 2 weeks ago there was a strike in the UK, so it's part and parcel of doing business. And the sooner we bring labour on board and actually work together with them to forge a common destiny, I think the better.
And of course, the unions, Stavros would say that it was a blind spot for the BRICS member countries to have excluded the voice of unions in the first place. But now that there seems to be some degree of convergence, what role do you see the union voice playing? What contribution can they make in this summit?
Well, I think firstly, Vavi is correct in saying that you can never get meaningful economic growth unless you take the considerations of the workers into account. So I know personally I would support them being in the forum, and I think part of our successes in the past here in South Africa have been premised on having government, business and labour being aligned and working in sync. So the same logic should apply at BRICS, I guess, and I would welcome their participation.
And moving from the unions, but coming back to you, Glenn, and maybe to pose the BRICS Business Council question to you before I get one of the members, Stavros, to speak on it. But we are now seeing a chairmanship that is removed from South Africa. We also heard comments from Patrice Motsepe saying that even on the South African front, he would be somewhat taking a bit of a backstep from the council. Should we be concerned about African engagement for the Business Council, especially under chairmanship that is now not focused on or under South Africa at all?
No, I don't think so. I think the South African parties always said we're here for Africa, and I think the people within the council will probably continue on that momentum. It's a pity that Mr. Motsepe is stepping down, but I think people like Stavros and that will probably keep the flag flying and include Africa in it, because these are about regional blocks, and I think Africa South Africa is part of this continent, and so much part of this deal is probably the whole continent, not just South Africa.
Are there mechanisms in place, Stavros, to ensure that there's continuity of engagement?
No, there most certainly is, and that's why I share Glenn's view. I don't have the fear that there's going to be a sudden deceleration. Although I must say Patrice Motsepe was a very effective chairman, but I think that we've got this annual report that lays a platform from which the Brazilians can pick up the baton now and move into a different phase. So the phase we've got to move into now is more an implementation, operationalization and execution of business deals and transactions. So I think there's sufficient checks and balances to make sure that the Brazilians pick up from where South Africa left off.
Does the chairmanship of Brazil now also maybe open up more opportunities for bigger play with South American business? Are we likely to see that maybe South America merging or mirroring the African continent in terms of cross-pollination of opportunities?
Well, after listening to the Argentinian supporters at the World Cup, I'm not sure that's the case. No, I'm kidding. I think that it's always been the intention of BRICS, the BRICS formation, to obviously strengthen the BRICS in intra-trade, but also to look at opportunities outside of BRICS. And I think, as Glenn says, and Vavi, as they both said, these things are all about economic blocks and how you integrate those economic blocks. So I do see additional opportunities.
Just remind us before we go back to Glenn in Cape Town about the BRICS think tank. We didn't really hear much about the think tank in the open plenary sessions. How does it fit into the broader mechanism?
So I think the think tank looks more at the sort of high-level strategic issues. And I think as a business council, we take a more pragmatic outlook on things. So, you know, things like policy development and, you know, international trade policies, I think those are sort of handled at a think tank level, and we come in and look more at the operational execution.
Glenn, I'm a bit concerned, in particular because I get the sense that there is a disconnect between what the BRICS Business Council is doing and some of the propositions that would come from the think tank. I'm not getting a sense that at a high level there is feed-through into the Business Council, in particular because if we look at the structural trade imbalances that still exist within the BRICS member countries, do you share the sentiment, or are you more inclined towards Stavros in terms of saying there is maybe a seamless feed-through?
I think there is, and I think from that session we had with the Trade Minister, it was very clear from business side that things like tariffs, equity in terms of standards, etc., that's been fed back from business to the ministers and taken up at a political level. So I think from that side, I think there's a lot of push from business to government as to a fairer deal for South African business.
We count the new development bank as one of the key achievements of the BRICS Business Council. What would be attributed as a key achievement to the BRICS think tank?
So I think the discussion around some of the policy issues and how that flowed into the annual BRICS Business Council report, for me, is a critical element to look at. Incidentally, the report that I'm making reference to, I think it's about a 50-page document odd. We try to keep it as short as we could, is available on the website. And I'd encourage people to, you know, particularly business people, to tap into that report and have a look at where the opportunities lie. Of course, as I keep saying, we'll only be able to measure the success of that report once we start seeing how Brazil starts implementing some of the proposed transactions and some of the deals.
One of the treaties, Glenn, that was signed in the plenary session was to improve the collaboration between existing development banks, especially in the area of innovation, which I thought was quite interesting. Let me get your sense there in terms of what opportunities do you think this might open up?
I think if you look at the African continent and what we've actually developed here, I think the capital for those inventions and product innovation, I think, especially for the developing world, I think to have that capital available opens a huge range of market opportunities.
And of course, Stavros, so one of the key questions that has been raised has been if we're looking at the economic fundamentals in terms of economic growth rates in many of the emerging markets, somewhat slowing down. If you look at the geopolitical tensions that Russia in particular is involved in, it almost creates a bit of a big grey cloud over the BRICS member countries. And the question then becomes, what is the future of BRICS? Do you get a sense of confidence that irrespective of some of these things that I mentioned now, that the future is bright?
You know, I think the best way to answer the question is to say by 2030, which coincides with the time frame of our own National Development Plan, the NDP, that 4 of the 5 BRICS member countries will occupy 4 of the top 6 biggest economies globally. So if there's any doubt about where these economies are going or their growth rates are, for me that's a very telling statistic, and that kind of gives an indication of the economic dominance that BRICS presently enjoys, but that will futuristically enjoy. You know, so economies like India will become the 3rd biggest economy. China will have overtaken the United States by then. So I've got absolute full confidence that these will continue to be highly influential economies.
And a final question to you, Glenn. Do you see this optimism that Stavros has shared here in Johannesburg?
Most definitely. I think BRICS just gives us that opportunity to take that NDP to real operationalization and to development of the continent.
Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you to my guests and thank you for joining us. Don't forget to send us your comments on email as well as on Twitter. The contact details are all on screen. Next week, we're talking m-commerce in Africa. But for now, Bruce Whitfield is standing by to bring you Tonight with Bruce. For myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye for now.